And after a while, students were interested. So in fact, a number of the students went on and became professionals, and actually one of them was chair of a linguistics department somewhere. There were mathematicians who became interested and so on. There was a certain increase in interest among undergraduates, and by that time we were getting visitors from outside who just heard about it and wanted to know something about it. And by about 1960, we had one visitor who was at a point where he could get a PhD, but there was no PhD department. So MIT's it's sort of the core of its role that has been pretty much to create the advanced economy of the future. So if you use computers and the internet and information technology, pharmaceuticals, whatever it may be, a good part of it is created here and in some similar places, primarily through government funding. And it's on the side, increasingly over the years, it's shifted from being, the years I've been here, from being an engineering school, which is what it was when I got here, to just a science-based university, which had a lot of side effects. For example, one side effect was enrichment of the humanities, social sciences department, because as the student body shifted from engineering-oriented to science-oriented, they just had different interests, concerns, and needs, and the university adapted to them. But the role in the world should be to, like any other university, a place of free inquiry, interchange, and thought. This one particular university happens to be focused primarily, but no, not solely, on science. Secondarily technology, because that's become more and more of an offshoot of science. A place where students at the most free period of their lives, out of parental control, not yet into the stage of having to put food on the table, can inquire and create, find themselves. For the faculty, same thing, constant innovation, excitement, both from students, from other faculty, from the outside world, and it should be an environment in which they can pursue those interests and concerns in a constructive way. And to an unusual extent, it's been that, I think, during the period I've been here. Changed a lot, so it was quite different in the 50s. Well, it's grown a lot. So in the mid-50s, you kind of knew everybody, so you had a question, you wanted to talk to the provost, his personal friend, and so on. But now it's for each individual, it's kind of more impersonal because it's so much larger and more complex. But it remains, at least in my experience, pretty much the same kind of place. So the field developed. The modern field of linguistics, to a large extent, developed at MIT, but it was in the electronics lab. I mean, yes, the administrative offices were in the modern language department, but the contacts there were pretty restricted. The main connections were in RLE, the electronics lab, which is a highly interdisciplinary lab in those days, in the 50s. In fact, a lot of the particular specific departments that now exist and have spread around were sort of sitting there in Building 20 with a lot of interaction between them. And linguistics fit there perfectly. It was right at the core of the emerging cognitive sciences. They didn't really exist at the time. They were just coming into existence, and language was at the core of it, and has in many ways remained so. It was an interconnection of mathematical interests, computational interests, study of increasing interdisciplinary study of sort of mind in a broad sense, its implications for other aspects of human behavior and interaction. So it has a sort of a natural spot. The study of language always has at the intersection of the sciences and the humanities, of the social sciences. And here it developed very in a very natural way in the pretty unstructured and open environment of the old Building 20, Research Lab of Electronics. I worked a lot with George Miller, as professor of psychology at Harvard. We had close ties to Bell Labs up and back, Lincoln Labs to an extent, but then the various expanding departments here. So psychology and the cognitive sciences weren't a separate program. They grew out of the RLE environment. It's less intimate than when you're in the next room. So the disappearance of Building 20 was kind of a sad moment. In fact, there was an effort among some of us to try to preserve it as a historical monument. It was a really wonderful place to work. First of all, there was no security, so you could be in day or night. Some students are practically living there, no guards at the doors. It's kind of astonishing to me that nothing was ever stolen, had a lot of equipment in it and so on. And of course, at the time, this was kind of like an urban neighborhood, factories, working class housing and so on. But my colleague, Morris Halley, and I were still in next door offices, but we started in '55. We were off in one corner of RLE, which was a Second World War temporary building, incredibly hot over the summer. So we tried to put in an air conditioner, but you had to have permission. So we asked permission from the whatever chain of bureaucracy it was. And we finally got a note back saying we couldn't do it because it would be inconsistent with the decor of Building 20. The other thing in Building 20 was that it was a temporary building. You could move the walls around. So it was kind of randomized inside, which had very nice properties. So like, for example, I happened to find a little corner of it that didn't have a room but had no windows. So I figured I'm not going to use it for anything. So I asked if I could use it just for books. They said, sure, fine. So I had a big storage space for books. That was nice. Well, it's a very interesting building. It's not really a place to work. I mean, so for example, and I do my work at home now. Like I don't even have a computer in the office, and it's for appointments, interviews, things like that. So for example, it has a slanted wall, which is not to make a lot of sense for a faculty office. I mean, what you need is a place to put books and a blackboard and things like that. But it's it's an interesting, attractive building. It's fine. Actually, I think it was built to be interactive. My impression is it's probably less interactive than the old building, which wasn't built for anything. It was just put up, I don't think so. As far as the profession was concerned, in fact, it's a kind of an interesting fact that what happened in the United States has replicated throughout much of the world. Modern linguistics developed on the periphery of the academic system. So here at MIT, not at Harvard. And that's been true as it later expanded throughout the world. It was very different from the modern field developed in a manner which was quite different, in fact antithetical in many ways to the existing disciplines. And it was not, it was not welcomed. So for example, for years, I didn't publish in linguistics journals. I published in engineering journals or something like that. And in fact, I remember my first monograph, which came out in 1957, was published in Holland. But shortly after it, there was a review of American linguistics by somebody. And he had a footnote. He said, "Won't mention this because this is Dutch linguistics," that kind of thing. So it wasn't. We actually founded a new journal, Linguistic Inquiry, published by MIT Press, in large measure because the work that was coming out here, students and us couldn't really. There was no natural place to put it within the linguistics profession. I mean, in fact, it has interesting roots back in the tradition of linguistics, actually back to the millennia, back to the early Indian grammarians, but that had been almost entirely forgotten by the profession. I started working in it myself, but by now there's a field of, a much richer field than there was of history of linguistics, but that came out of here to a significant extent, off on the periphery of the field. And as I say, that's replicated elsewhere. Because remember, MIT was an engineering school. In fact, I mean, they had a very good math and physics department, but to a large extent they were service departments, teaching the engineers so they could do things. Kind of ironic, the role that it played. Actually, not just me, incidentally, there were faculty peace groups in the 50s and the early 60s. And they were largely MIT-based, not Harvard-based. My own role was RLE, where it was 100% supported by the three armed services. And in fact, MIT altogether was, I think, about 90% Pentagon funded at the time. But it was also the center of anti-Vietnam War, academic center of anti-Vietnam War activism, resistance. There was no interference. I mean, the record for academic freedom is very good. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but by and large, quite good. It was the source of a lot of things that have happened since. So I personally was, at the time, there was virtually nothing, and maybe one course in philosophy, almost, psychology was practically nothing. I did introduce the first modern philosophy courses, and it helped establish what's now a flourishing department. The brain and behavioral sciences sort of grew out of the interactions, mostly at RLE in the late 50s, early 60s. I was part of it, along with Luke Teuber, who I mentioned. I think that's part of a broader development that took place since the 50s. As I say, at the time, it mainly was an engineering school, so students were making things, build electric circuits. Students took, if you were studying mechanical engineering and civil engineering, electrical engineering, you'd take quite a different curriculum because it was oriented towards the technology of the time. Well, after the Second World War, there was a substantial change in the relationship between science and technology. I mean, there had always been a relationship. So Archimedes was a scientist, but contributing to armaments. But there was a qualitative change during and after the Second World War. I mean, the sciences became really essential to technology in a way that they hadn't been. They had been an aid. It's kind of like biology and medicine. Medicine, of course, is paying attention to biology, but couldn't contribute much. But this transition took place primarily at that time, and as it took place, it was reflected in MIT and to a certain extent stimulated by MIT, so it was an interaction. And it shifted the character of the institute altogether. So now it shouldn't really be called Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's a science-based university. Students in the various fields take pretty much the same courses, maybe slightly adapted to their own interests. And they also have a range of other interests, philosophy, humanities, and so on. So it's kind of a university based around science. And I don't know how much it's understood in the outside world, but that's the way it should be perceived. And the role of linguistics and economics and so on just sort of fits pretty naturally into that. I was born in Philadelphia in 1928. My parents were immigrants. They themselves were pretty much in a sort of a Jewish ghetto, an immigrant community ghetto, not physically like scattered all over the city, but their contacts were with other contacts were with other people very much like them. Now, the Jewish immigrant community was split into various different directions, and my parents happened to be involved in, for them the primary interest was revival of Hebrew. So my father was a Hebrew scholar, my mother was a Hebrew teacher, the language was being revived, the culture was being revived, and that's what they did. My father ran the Hebrew school system in Philadelphia. My mother was active in it. All of my friends and my wife, everyone else, we all came out of that milieu. And there was, it was not particular, it wasn't, it was observant but not religious, and it was kind of oriented towards Palestine. People would have called themselves Zionists, I did too, but in a sense quite different from post-1948. So my father, for example, was what was called in those days a cultural Zionist, a follower of Ahad Ha'am, a leading writer in the early part of the revival of Hebrew a century ago, whose vision was that there should be a cultural center for Jewish life in Palestine. My father came at the age of 17 from the Ukraine, just in time to escape being drafted into the Tsar's army, which was a death sentence for Jewish boys. And my mother's family came. She came when she was about 1 from what's now Belarus. And there was a Kulturkampf going on in the Jewish community between the Hebrew-oriented and the Yiddish-oriented. They were on the Hebrew side, so I never heard a word of Yiddish. That was my parent. It was like their secret language. You weren't even supposed to know Hebrew. I mean, you use Hebrew for prayer or like reading the Bible, but you're not supposed to speak it. So even looking at modern Hebrew literature, which was developing at the time, was considered heresy. But he went on and learned some Russian, which I doubt if his father even knew about. But that was not part of our background. It was, you know, to the extent that it was not an English-speaking thing, it was Hebrew-oriented. They sent me from that age, one and a half, I guess, to a private school, and my father was interested. He was kind of very much influenced by John Dewey's educational and other ideas, and this was a Deweyite progressive school run by Temple University, which had a Deweyite educational program department. And I was there from before 2 until school ended at 12. That was a fantastic environment. In fact, I remember elementary school much better than high school. I remember everything that happened. It was on Deweyite lines. There was encouragement of students to think independently, work creatively, work with others, a lot of interaction projects. There was virtually no, I didn't even know I was a good student until I got to high school, because there was no ranking. I mean, I knew I'd skipped a year, and everybody else knew I'd skipped a year, but all that meant I was the smallest kid in the class, you know, but didn't have any other connotations. You know, like a lot of private schools, it was a mixed story. There were kids whose parents were kind of achievement-oriented, and there were kids who just couldn't make it in the public schools, or problem children, so you get a usual mixture. But there was a sense that people weren't ranked, kids weren't ranked, so everyone's supposed to be doing their best, you know, they're praised if they do their best. In the city, there were 2 academically oriented high schools, one for boys and one for girls. My wife went to the girls one, I went to the boys one. And for me, at least, that's kind of like a black hole. I barely remember it. I hated it. I couldn't stand it. As I say, I quickly learned I'm supposed to be a good student, all A's. It was everything I did was on the outside. We were working students. We went to the local school. There was no other choice. And although it was pretty inexpensive at that time, I think it was $100 a year or something. Couldn't make it without a scholarship, so I got a scholarship and went to Penn, which was, in those days, not all that different. In fact, Penn was, I got out of high school at 16. I was pretty excited about going to college. I thought it would be interesting. I'm done with this boring stuff. And the catalog looked great and so on, so I took what I thought would be interesting courses, but I found it was overgrown high school. In fact, after about a year, I was thinking of dropping out. It's changed a lot. Penn is now a major university, but at that time it was substantially a football fraternity school with a scattering of extremely good faculty. So the more academically oriented students who sort of found each other many of them, like me, had a variety of interests that weren't connected, because you were kind of like attracted by a terrific mathematician, in my case, country's outstanding linguist, a few great philosophers, kind of these things. In fact, by the time I was a junior, I was mostly taking graduate courses and really didn't have an undergraduate education. You know, in that generation, you just didn't talk much to your parents. There were a lot of things they didn't know about our lives. So, for example, we happened to be the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, which was rabidly anti-Semitic, in fact, pretty pro-Nazi during the 30s. And that was these boys in the street. Family, at least the part I got involved in, was mostly unemployed working class, pretty radical. Some of them had essentially no formal education. In fact, the uncle who was most influential in my life had never gotten past 4th grade, but he's one of the most educated people I've ever met. He was physically disabled, so he was able to get to run a newsstand under some New Deal program. And he collected a circle of European emigres. I thought there was a newspaper in New York called the News and Mirror. People would run out and ask for the News and Mirror. It was a very lively environment. And by the time I was old enough to go to New York by myself, like about 12, I'd immediately gravitate there on weekends and so on. That's around 1940, approximately. And there was a big refugee population in New York, a lot of people fleeing from fascism. And in New York at that time, I guess 4th Avenue from Union Square down south was full of little bookstores. Spent a lot of time hanging around those. The anarchist offices, Freie Arbeiterstimme office, and I guess it was in Union Square, and spent time there. A couple of my relatives, and particularly my uncle, were also very much involved in such things. And I just got a totally separate political education. In fact, what drew me back to college at Penn was meeting Zelig Harris, and he was a professor at Penn. I didn't know it at the time, but he was the leading linguist in maybe the world or the country. But and he kind of, in retrospect, I think he was trying to talk me into coming back to college or something. But he suggested a couple of other faculty members, in particular in philosophy and math, and suggested I take their graduate courses. I was there for 4 years, and it was a research fellowship with no particular constraints, so you could sit in a desk in Widener Library in those days and have the whole resources of the library, the university, a lot of bright young colleagues. So a very intellectually stimulating environment, and again, free to explore. In a way, it was back to elementary school. Well, partly it was just having acquaintance with other fields, like logic and foundations of mathematics, other things. There are concepts that were developed there which did seem to me to be applicable to the study of language. Now, at the time, well, I'll just give you an example. At the time, the way when I was an undergraduate student formally in linguistics, a standard, say, term paper would be to go to the International Journal of American Linguistics, a journal where people did descriptive studies of American Indian languages, and take one of the articles, phonology of Cherokee or something, and do what was called a structural restatement. That is, restate it in a more elegant form, using procedures of analysis. It was sort of like inductive procedures of analysis, which were most extensively developed in Zelig Harris's book, which the first edition of his book was called Methods in Structural Linguistics, and that's what it was. It was methods. In fact, I learned the field from proofreading the book for him when we met, and he was sort of, I presume, enticing me back to college or whatever it was. He asked me if I'd proofread I kind of learned the field that way. But that's what you learned methods, you applied them, and you got a restatement of the descriptive data. And that's what we did. When it came time to do a undergraduate thesis, Harris suggested to me that I do that with modern Hebrew, which I knew fairly well, not perfectly, but well enough. So I started to do it the way we were taught. You get an informant, Israeli informant, that was just about from the Jewish community in Palestine, Hebrew speaker, native Hebrew speaker, and ask. There's field methods. You're taught how to elicit data from an informant. So I'd use the field methods, get the data, and start organizing it according with methods. And after a while, I was working entirely by myself. It just seemed to me that this is senseless. For one thing, I know the answers to everything I'm asking him, except for the parts I don't care about, like the pronunciation, because I don't care about pronunciation. So what's the point? So I just sort of put it aside and did what seemed kind of obvious. Intuitively, it is obvious, namely write what's now called a generative grammar. That is, try to find a set of rules and principles from which you can mechanically derive the structures of the infinite number of expressions of a language, and the structures have to feed into basically two other systems of the mind, or the body, the sensory motor system. You've got to pronounce it, and the thought system's has to be interpreted. So that's what's now called the generative grammar. But at those days, I didn't know at the time that there was a tradition of doing something kind of similar to that, which in fact goes back to the Indian grammarians of 2,500 years ago. And it sort of persisted in kind of a back strain of the field, but it was not what anybody knew about. It was off there in some exotic place. And by the mid-1950s, the 20th century, you could actually do things like this in a fairly precise way. In the 30s, 1930s and the 1940s, that was the beginning of the really extensive and careful development of what's now known as the theory of computability. There were major results in the field. Theory of computability, recursive function theory. I was studying these things on the side. And it did give the ideas were kind of in the air, but this made them readily available in a precise enough form so that you could actually formulate what was what I later came to be called a generative grammar in these terms. And pretty much the way you could, on the model of the way you can do what's called metamathematics, the study of formal mathematics as a theory in terms of a theory of computability, which had really profound results, many of them. So kind of melding these things together as an undergraduate, it just gave, I did this thesis. I don't think anybody ever looked at it. And when I got to Harvard, I was kind of schizophrenic for a while. For a while I was, in many ways, for one thing, I was committed intellectually to the belief that the procedural approach of the quasi-inductive analysis of data must be the right one, because that's what all the smart people were doing. But on the other half of my brain, this seemed to make a lot more sense. I did this thesis. I don't think anybody ever looked at it. Anyway, it was done. And when I got to Harvard, I was kind of schizophrenic for a while. For a while, I was, in many ways, for one thing, I was committed intellectually to the belief that the procedural approach of the quasi-inductive analysis of data must be the right one, because that's what all the smart people were doing. But on the other half of my brain, this seemed to make a lot more sense. And I sort of tried to work on both for a while. And at some point, in fact, I remember the exact point, in 1953, my wife and I were taking the graduate student backpacking trip to Europe. So we were on some old half-sinking boat and going over to Europe, and I was completely seasick. And I don't know what. Anyhow, it just occurred to me that I was actually getting results from the generative grammar approach, while the other approach was just kind of technical formalization, which wasn't going anywhere. So I kind of decided, okay, I'll drop that and continue with the generative grammar. Meanwhile, there was a side issue. This was the period of behavioral science. So the social sciences, psychology, they were studies of behavior. And that had a kind of a similarity to the structural linguistics of the period. The topic was data, and the problem is how to control, organize, describe to organize and describe data and to control performance. That's what behavior psychology was. And that was just everywhere. It was Cambridge, for example, where I was. These were the dominant thinking, philosophy, psychology, social sciences, and it just never made any sense to me. I wasn't alone. There's a small group of graduate students who were kind of resistant to the prevailing sentiment. So one of them is Morris Halley. He was at Harvard with me. He was working in phonetics labs, so he was working here. And I don't think he was teaching, but he was in the labs at MIT. In fact, my wife was working in the same lab in the early 50s. I met Morris through my wife. Another was Eric Lenneberg, who went on later to become the founder of what's now called biology of language. Went on to medical school and did work. And there were a few others. One of them was a junior fellow, same place I was, Peter Elias, who was a mathematician whose specialty was information theory. And in fact, the first person from outside this small group of students who became at all interested was George Miller, who was a professor of psychology at Harvard. And the psychology department at Harvard was it was kind of characteristic of the times. There were three major professors, B.F. Skinner, Smitty Stevens, George Miller. Skinner and Stevens both knew the total truth, but it was different truths. So if you were a student of Skinner, you weren't allowed to take courses with Stevens, and conversely. Eric Lenneberg, who was in psychology, had a lot of problems with that. And then there was George Miller, who was kind of eclectic, open-minded, thinking about other things. So students who didn't fit into the straitjackets drifted towards Miller. And I met him. He was kind of interested in what I was doing, and we actually spent a summer together in Stanford working on this stuff. But even with that, there was essentially no resonance. I mean, the book that I was writing, I was writing a book on my own at the Society of Fellows. It was finished in 1955, and my wife and I ran off about 800 pages on hectographs. Everything in the world turns purple when you. We ran off a couple copies, 20 copies for friends, and somebody suggested that I submit it to MIT Press, which I did, but it came back pretty soon with pretty sensible comments. They rejected it, but the comments from the reviewers were that they hadn't a clue what it was. There's no such field. Where does it belong? So this doesn't. So they said it just doesn't make any sense. So in your early 20s, you're thinking about what you're doing. You don't really care what the world thinks. So there were a lot of things that just seemed to be discoveries, and I was excited about them, and a couple of people I could talk to were. But then I got involved to some extent in a formal theory of automata, and that I could publish. I could publish in engineering journals, journals of information and control. At the time I was 1956, and so I was at MIT, and there was a lot of outside interest, and it's kind of loosely related to linguistics. I mean, the formal systems are similar in some respects to the systems of natural language, not terribly close, but similar. And this could go on in parallel. It's kind of a sub-branch of the theory of computation. It's sort of, and other mathematicians got interested and so on. But the actual linguistic work was very restricted. Roman Jakobson, who was great, was a personal friend, and he was at Harvard at the time, but he was a leading figure in the whole community. He knew Jerry Wiesner. He suggested I didn't have any possible academic appointment. I had no field. When I got out of the Society of Fellows, PhD and everything, I had no thought of going into the academic world because there was nowhere to go. But Jakobson suggested I talk to Jerry Wiesner, and so I did an appointment with him. And he asked what I was doing. I kind of described what I was doing, and then he suggested that I come to RLE and work on a machine translation project. They had a project of trying to, develop computer programs that could translate language. And I told him, I don't think the project makes any sense. I mean, the only way to solve this problem is brute force. What's going to be thought about language is not really going to help, and I'm just not interested, so I'm not going to do it. It made no sense. And over the years, it's, I think, become clear why it made no sense. That's what RLE was like. He was just, it was just encouraging a lot of innovative, strange people with odd ideas. Some of them worked out, some didn't. You know, people knew each other in those days. It was a fairly small community. So, you know, we're friendly, but not close personal friends. Soon he went off to the Kennedy administration, came back and became provost and so on, but president later. But the same with the others, like Walter Rosenblith, who was there, later became provost, and Luke Teuber branched out to different fields, different departments. But internal to the RLE community, there was interest, and there was George Miller at Harvard. This later, by the mid-50s, the kind of Bible in the sort of intellectual community of these topics was Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, which was circulating in manuscript when I got to Harvard. And that's what, you know, Van Quine, who a main philosopher, studied with him. It's kind of like the Bible. And, you know, I read it. It didn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. So I finally wrote a critical review of it. That turned out to get a lot of attention. That came out in 1959. I wrote it in 57. You know, it was part of a sort of a growing, it was part of the growth of cognitive science and neuroscience related to cognitive science and so on. And there was an undercurrent there of discomfort with the behaviorist sort of ideology. It was kind of like a religion almost. And this fit into that and contributed to it. And in fact, there was work by, it was so considered so out of tune with the mainstream that nobody paid any attention to it. In fact, I was right in the middle of all of this, and I never heard of it. I found out about it from an art critic, Meyer Shapiro. I saw, look, this is really important. So my review of Skinner may be the first article that even referred to it. In those days, you couldn't do a database search easily, but I couldn't find any reference. And it was apparently novel to the people I showed it to. But then there were a couple of other things like that within comparative psychology, which was at those days pretty different from experimental psychology. There was work coming out that was just inconsistent with the behaviorist approach. There was also another development was ethology. It's now comparative zoology with Konrad Lorenz and Tinbergen and others. And this small group of graduate students, we were reading that material, and you could see that it just didn't fit at all with the behaviorist ideologies. Well, we were in the modern language department, and we had to pay our dues by teaching. Morris, who was there, I forget, he was probably teaching. And the only courses I could teach were, in those days they had cram courses for PhD students to help them fake their way through reading exams. And fake is the right word. I mean, pre-Second World War, if you wanted to be a civil engineer, say, you had to know French and German because the United States was kind of like an intellectual backwater. The main work was being done in Europe. But all of that changed totally during the Second World War for obvious reasons. And none of the graduate students were ever going to read an article in French or German, almost unbelievable. But they still had the residue of the exams. And the only way to deal with it was for the modern language department to run courses in which you taught graduate students enough tricks so that they could fake their way through the exam, and then had to read and translate a paper in their own fields. Well, you take a look at a paper in your own field, you understand the formulas, you understand the international words, and you learn that the verb is over here instead of over here, and so on. You can kind of fake your way through it. Those are the courses I was teaching. And after a while, students were interested. So, in fact, a number of the students went on and became professionals, and actually one of them was chair of a linguistics department somewhere. There were mathematicians who became interested and so on. there was a certain increase in interest among undergraduates, and by that time we were getting visitors from outside who just heard about it and wanted to know something about it. And by about 1960, we had one visitor who was at a point where he could get a PhD, but there was no PhD department, so the electrical engineering department agreed to let him get his PhD in Turkish nominalization in the electrical engineering department. But it was sort of reaching the point where you could think about a graduate department. And MIT was pretty free and open, so they agreed that we could establish a graduate department. And shortly after that, also in philosophy, because that was building up a similar way. I was, again, very much involved in the appointments and teaching and so on. Once it became a department, we could have students, we could have courses. Students contribute a lot to the development of a field, so it became richer, much more exciting. And the early graduate students went off and started their own departments, which is hard. They had to try to work their way into the field. By the late 60s, it was at first the only department actually in the world that was dealing with this kind of thing, but foreign students, they went back to their own countries. And gradually, by the 70s, it was kind of, the move from working in an office at RLE to talking to the president was a very brief move, not a lot of stages in between. The war in Vietnam actually started in 1962. That's when Kennedy started the bombing of South Vietnam, and chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, rounding people up into camps and so on. But there was no protest. I mean, just non-existent. It was a very quiescent period all over the country, in fact. The first talks I was giving were in somebody's living room or in a church with 4 people or something like that. By the mid-60s, some activism was developing. Actually, in 1965, this is all on my own time. I had nothing to do with MIT. I started organizing national tax resistance, or trying to, and within a year or two, it was much broader resistance. In fact, by 1968, I was coming up for federal trial. In fact, it was expanded, and I was giving lots of talks and so on. Meanwhile, I introduced, with a friend who's also on the faculty, we introduced undergraduate courses on social and political issues, Louis Kempf, but I did it on my own time. He did it as part of his, it sort of fit into his department, but for me it was just, my own time. And by the late 60s, he had hundreds of students. And meanwhile, the mood in the university was changing. Student activism was kind of taking off. Here it was late, but by 1968 it was substantial. There were major events that took place, which had a big effect on the Institute. So there were just a small number of students who were active, but they kind of galvanized the place. It must have been late 1968 or so on. Late 1968, the students decided, I didn't think it was a good idea, but they went ahead to set up what was called a sanctuary for a deserter. There was a Marine deserter, talked to him, made sure he understood what he was doing, understood the consequences and so on. And nobody came to, and they said, well, okay, we're going to stay with this Marine deserter until the FBI comes and picks him up. Within about a week, the Institute was half shut down. Half the student body was over there all the time. It was 24 hours, seminars, rock music, everything of the kind that was going on in those days. And it had a tremendous effect on the student body. It had an effect on the Institute. One of the effects was that it just raised in the student body and some of the faculty an awareness that we should be thinking about what we're doing. And then came March 4th, 1969, when the Institute was closed for a day, just for seminars and discussions and meetings about uses of technology. How do we think about the consequences of what we're doing instead of just making stuff we ask what it's for, what we should be doing. Should we be doing something else? That was really, individuals had thought about things like this, but this was really the first time that there was an organized concern about it, and out of that grew a lot of things. In fact, the Institute just changed radically. These became central topics. The Union of Concerned Scientists came out of that. Henry Kendall, who was a Nobel Prize physicist and had been a Pentagon planner, he was working on planning bombing in Indochina, but he kind of, I remember we talked about it. Just kind of went through a personal conversion and thought, we've got to change this. And he became a leading figure in the physics department in what became the Union of Concerned Scientists, and a lot of other things developed out of it. But he was, kind of on the extreme dovish side of the sort of Kennedy administration, and he never really accepted the fact that the students and the activists considered him a kind of a collaborator, because he thought he was taking a strong stand against, the war, nuclear weapons, and so on. But from the students' point of view, and the activists' point of view, that wasn't the case, and there was never really a reconciliation. By the late 60s, the student movement really had a very brief existence. So it started in the early 60s, civil rights movement and so on, but gradually grew. By the late 60s, it was a huge phenomenon. By 1969, it was falling apart. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which was the nationwide student organization, had a rapid expansion in the late 60s, but by 1969 it was collapsing. Broke up into two wings, and we had a lot of work, I remember, trying to talk students out of going in those directions. You can understand the attraction, people were desperate, upset, things, but I had arranged to teach in Oxford for a semester. I was the John Locke lecturer at Oxford. Well, the dean really pleaded with me to be on it, so I had 4 transatlantic trips a week. Teach in Oxford, come here, go to a committee meeting, go back the next day and teach in Oxford again. I had promised the semester at Oxford, and I didn't want to give that up. And the John Locke lectureship I wanted to give, but and I was giving talks all over England at the same time. The Pounds Commission was set up to try to head off a confrontation that nobody wanted. The protests against the labs were building up to the point where they were going to lead to a confrontation. The administration didn't want it, the students didn't want it. So what you do is you set up a committee, and the committee was going to review the state of Pentagon-related activity at the Institute. It turned out roughly, actually nobody even knew what the finances were. The finances of the Institute were not even in anybody's head. They were just kind of like chaos. A ton of money was pouring in. It turned out roughly that the 2 military laboratories were approximately half of Institute expenditures. But nobody really knew if they were contributing to the Institute or taking from it. Like, how much did the library contributions matter? So that had to be sorted out. And of the academic side, I think about 90% was Pentagon-based. But there was no classified work going on campus. Indirectly everything can be war-related, except in the political science department. They were working on counterinsurgency under what was called a Peace Research Institute with closed seminars and things like that. But elsewhere it was in the labs. On the other hand, the labs were very closely integrated with the Institute. So, for example, my wife was a programmer at Lincoln Labs, and I was in RLE. No particular barrier. But the real issue in the Pounds Commission was whether to separate the laboratories from the Institute. There were sort of 3 views that came out. There was what was called the liberals, who said, yeah, we got to separate them from the campus. There were the conservatives who said, got to keep them on campus. And there were 2 or 3 of us, one student, one me, who were called the radicals, who agreed with the conservatives. We got to keep them on campus so that people know what's going on. And it's a focus of attention and concern, and you think about it. Let's not hide it somewhere where the same relationships are going to continue, but under an apparent administrative break. Well, we lost. They were formally separated, but it was an interesting time. However, it's about the time of the May 4th and these other developments, and did make a change.